So the word that is always kind of dangerous is inspiring. So I don't know if my talk will be inspiring. Because that sets a very high expectation. But the talk's about change and transformation, and just one sort of observation, which just sort of randomly occurred to me while I was sitting there, is that I think we all kind of get the sense that we're living through quite an extraordinary period of social, political, and scientific technological change. And here's my theory. Two theories. One is that it's a bit like the 1960s, which I did miss, again, and we'll look back on this period and really reflect on what an extraordinary period. But here's an assertion, I don't know if you'd agree with it, that I think Germany is probably at one of the most fundamental places in terms of change in the world. Why? Because you unified East and West Germany, and frankly, it went pretty well. And then you look at the amount of change that's been affecting Germany this year. So from my detached observation, there's the whole situation in Greece and the Eurozone. And whether we agree or don't agree with the whole philosophy, Germany has been fundamental to the change there. Then we have Germany's transformational approach to the refugee crisis. And meanwhile, as just another week passes by, one of the great German institutions, an iconic company, starts to kind of look a bit fragile, and where's the trust gone? So I think you're probably living in one of the countries in the world where change is probably happening more fundamentally than anywhere, which makes your job in the digital workplace probably easier because you're surrounded by an ecosystem of change. Happy to debate whether my theory is true at the coffee break. So the talk's about the digital renaissance of work, and it's fine to talk about change and the future of work. But if you talk about a renaissance happening in work, it's really to assert that work is getting better, which is always quite a dangerous thing to say. But my fundamental belief is that work is shifting from work as obligation, suffering, and duty to work as passion, fulfillment, and enjoyment. I said this to quite a leading journalist in the UK, and she said to me, yeah, that's fine. It might be for some, but there's a whole lot of people it isn't like that for. And I'll come on to that in a little bit. But I do believe that some of the kind of characteristics of work that were reserved for artists and artisans in the past, who don't work because they have to, they work because they must. I was listening to a podcast interview of somebody who was very close to Andy Warhol, who said that for Andy Warhol, work was just part of living. And that's the experience of artists. But I think we're increasingly finding that individuals are getting increasing amounts of experience of that in their own work. I think for me, my sort of digital renaissance of work happened on the 20th of June, 1985. I'd been a city editor for Reuters in London, so ostensibly really quite a good job. And I left because I hated working in an office. And I hated working for anybody. And I sat in a cafe in Notting Hill, and I started writing a speech for a senior banker. And as I was sitting there, getting paid to do that, I had this sense of elation and freedom, like I'd been kind of released from some sort of prison. And I think what I was actually experiencing, it wasn't that my work was fundamentally different at that moment. It was that I had this influence and ability to shape my work. And I think that's one of the characteristics that the digital workplace and the digital transformation of work offers. Just a little bit, just to reference what Bjorn said about the Digital Workplace Group, just so you know, we have a club that we run for major organizations globally, around about 100 major organizations across Europe and North America, rather like Gartner or Forrester, but focused on the enterprise. We've done about 800 benchmarks of intranets and digital workplaces over the last 13 years, and we also have a consulting business and then write books from time to time. Work didn't always used to be what it was now. And some of the reasons why this change is happening is that if you look at the background to where work was, this was quite a typical workplace going back to 1950. And it really kind of shows the Industrial Revolution had turned us into, if you like, efficient machines, pieces and components to deliver in that world. But if you look at a typical workplace now, and I'm sure most of your companies have got some aspects of this, you'll see that, and this is just from IKEA, this is from their head office, a lot of workplaces have started to change themselves into far more fluid environments. However, I think there's really still a huge disconnection between what's happening on the physical level and the digital level. So I was yesterday at a major insurance company in London, and I don't know if you've got this experience yourselves, but they've invested hundreds of millions in a new headquarters building in London. And guess what? Trying to kind of get people to join remotely into a meeting in a room like this is really kind of clunky. So the physical workplaces are going through a transformation, but I don't think the digital workplaces are going through the transformation that certainly they require. And one of the, technology. Right. So I always say to people when I get to a conference, does the clicker work okay? Great. Okay, thank you. Just the right one. So user error. So one of the things that I sometimes say at conferences when I say there's a digital renaissance of work and that work is going through this shift from obligation, duty, and suffering to work as liberation, passion, fulfillment, is tell me what the most boring job you can think of is. And interestingly enough, quite a lot of times people say refuse collection, garbage collection. I actually don't think of that as the worst job that I could think of. But let's think about somebody involved with keeping the city of Cologne clean. You take they have been digitally disconnected in their work. But if you give that individual the ability to have some influence over their shift patterns, when they work, when they start, when they finish, if you give them the ability to monitor through the data the effectiveness of the area that they're cleaning, along with their colleagues, and you put them into some sort of gamified situation with other groups who are going around Cologne, trying to keep their section clear and clean, and you start to create league tables, then you'll actually start to experience that that individual, it's not that they're not still cleaning and clearing garbage, but they're actually starting to get influence, a level of influence to some extent over their work, but they're also starting to get more data and understanding and insight into their work and a level of kind of gamification, which is not a word that I like, but I do think it's very, very powerful for people, starting to see where their own performance compares with other people. And I think that's a very powerful thing. And the scientific research shows that if you give an individual a small amount of influence over the shape and design of their working week, whether it's flexible working, whether it's the ability to select their shift patterns to some extent, their relationship with their work changes quite fundamentally and their own health changes. There are lots of definitions of the digital workplace, and we use two definitions in the digital workplace group. One is that it's the digital counterpoint to the physical world of work. So we work in physical environments like the one I was in yesterday in this insurance company, and they then also have a digital workplace environment which they work in. It's also the collection of tools, intranets, unified communications, HR systems, mobile, collaboration, Jive, Yammer, etc., and those range of tools which are all shaping and developing as we speak. And I think that it's quite fascinating to look at the transformation that's happening in that area. The area that we increasingly focus on, which we've blogged about, is the employee experience, and looking at the digital experience of work through the employee. And there are some organizations, I know there's somebody here from Shell, and I don't know if this actually happened, but they were looking at setting up an employee experience team. Unilever have been doing this, starting to think about it from the perspective of the individual inside the organization. I mean, one of the things just to say on this investment in the transformation of the physical workplaces, one of the things that I say to teams running digital workplaces around the world is create the digital workplace building that's the equivalent of the physical workplace. So we're going over for a member meeting to Coca-Cola's new headquarters in Atlanta, and I'm sure it's fantastic. But does the digital workplace team, are they opening a building, a digital workplace building that's got the same level of power, capability, and impact as the physical environment? I suspect not. And perhaps it's because it's human nature for us to gravitate towards things that we can touch and see, and in the digital workplace we're trying to do that in worlds that are harder to touch. This is just to show that the term digital workplace, and I'm not quite sure why, but it's really captured people's imagination. Gartner now have a hype cycle on the digital workplace. Avanade are reorganizing their work around the digital workplace, and the terms really become very, very ubiquitous. And I think it's because it's, perhaps for the technology vendors, gives meaning to their technology. They're concerned that they're deploying technologies that it's just another upgrade. It's Office 365. It's SharePoint in the cloud. It's the next iteration of Jive. It's going to be better than your intranet. And the digital workplace starts to talk about why this matters to the organization and the ability that it has to transform it. Just a few examples of what organizations can do that brings some of the digital renaissance of work into the organization. Barclays, the bank, decided that they couldn't change their organization by doing things in a traditional way through the normal channels of change inside the organization. Essentially, the organization was too slow and too resistant to change. So they took somebody who'd been a chief operating officer, a part of the bank, and they gave this individual, Stephen Roberts, a remit to transform the retail banking, to transform the experience of all of the people in the bank branches. They gave them 11,000 iPads. It was the largest purchase of iPads in, I think, 2012. They created a set of tools delivered to mobile devices. In the financial services sector, if there's anybody here from that sector, the challenge is always security. They brought the security, legal, and compliance people into their own team, into their change team. And they created the MyZone applications that were a transformation of the way that people worked in the branches. My daughter, I've got 3 grown-up daughters, and the middle one went into a Barclays branch about 4 weeks ago because she'd lost a debit card, and you can get the card replaced within 10 minutes. While she was in there, they set her up with some new applications on her iPhone, and I said, "What do you think of Barclays?" And she said, "They're incredible." So the question is, when do you often hear about 20-year-olds talking about banks as being incredible? And I think this is one of the points. This is just some illustrations of one of the earlier kind of manifestations of MyZone, and they try to create it in a consumerized, app-based way that's now become a little bit more common. And as you'll see here, that the improvements that you get when you make some of these changes are really quite significant. And if you'll see that there's a decrease in customer complaints of 50%, increase in customer adoption of digital of 500%, and then fewer jobs because of the digital transformation of work. And I think we're all very preoccupied about the automation of people in work. And one of the things I sometimes say to at conferences is, if you could run your organization without anybody, would you? If you could automate every single job inside the company away, would you? And I think this is an ethical and social and political question for us. And I think the answer for organizations is no, we wouldn't. And actually, one of the interesting things to notice is that while we've been concerned about the automation of work and the replacement of people, we've got a massive skill shortage. In the UK, the employment rate in the area where I live in Oxfordshire is basically zero. There are 3 million jobs being created in the app economy in Europe in the last 2 years. We're seeing this profusion of new roles, new jobs. There's a section in my book on the mismatch in education between what people are being trained in at school and what is required in the workplace, which I think is a huge issue for people. I was recently in San Francisco. There are kids of 15 leaving school with their parents' agreement, moving to San Francisco and living in dorms with 20 other people and actually surviving and making money because they're so bored by school. And this is a huge issue in the UK. One of the people who works for our company in the States has got quite a bright son. He's 13. Over the summer, he was studying a sort of advanced maths course. 4 days were online learning at home. And one day he went into school, met the other kids, got coaching from the teachers. He absolutely loved it. He actually didn't see any distinction between the two environments. I think in my mind, having grown up in a traditional school, you kind of go, oh my God, they're all going to be on their own. They're all on Xbox. It's digital isolation. But that's the generation that's coming through. It's not the millennial generation. It's the generation that's coming after them. And I think the division between the physical and the digital are really declining. Design patterns. I was talking about buildings that we gravitate to, and I noticed there's this huge investment going on at a corporate level into, probably set by the precedent of Google, how can we create physical environments that really inspire us? And we think of design in those environments. But when we're looking at our digital workplace, do we think about the design of those? I know we think about user experience, but do we think about what it would feel like to go into a digital environment, into a digital workplace that felt as pleasurable as a building that you really love to be in, or a room in your own home that you kind of gravitate to? The reality of the digital workplace inside most organizations at the moment is extremely fragmented, disconnected, and it's like having a building designed by 30 architects. And this is a quote from a professor of architecture who's now dead, called Christopher Alexander. And he wrote a book which had a huge influence on me called The Timeless Way of Building. And he really talks about patterns and why you walk into certain places. It could be the cathedral here. It could be into a lovely kind of park area. Why is it we feel alive in those environments? And also, what can we do to try and create this in the digital environments that are with us? And I think it's about trying to create this human-centered digital workplace. One of the things that we started doing in 2008, and I don't know if any of you tuned into it, but we have a round-the-world experience called Digital Workplace 24, when we connect thousands of people like yourselves around the world into an online tour, an online experience where we go through different tours of multiple different intranets, collaboration environments. And I remember when I was doing the first one, and I was doing it in my back garden where I live, And we were kind of saying to ourselves, as thousands of people tuned into this experience, what is this? And I think it's about trying to create this sense of a human-centered digital workplace. And not a human-centered digital workplace just within the confines of your organization, but as Unilever are realizing, there's 100,000 employees, but there's 100,000 people in their supply chain. So the digital workplace has the ability to move from inside the organization outside. So a few examples of organizations that I think are doing pretty good work at the moment is, one of them is Addedus. I saw Addedus's digital environment, digital workplace environment a few years ago. I don't think there's anybody from Addedus here, but it was pretty embarrassing. I could have said to them, I can't believe there's a brand like Addedus. This is what you're facing, people. And you know, we all know that experience. On paper, the new hire thinks the company looks really, really good, looks really interesting. They come in, fire up the technology, and their heart sinks. And at that point, they start thinking about where they might work next. But Addedus have really kind of transformed things, and they've created what's a real nice blend, delivered through mobile, tablet, a combination of apps and well-organized content. And I think they're starting to think about things from that human-centered position. Interestingly enough, I said to them when they came on Digital Workplace 24, there's not a lot of branding here. And they said our content is our branding. And again, I think that's trying to dig into what's the heart of the organization really about. This is another example from Adobe. You'd expect Adobe to create beautiful environments. And I think what they're trying to do is apply some of their thinking in their products into their digital workplace. And it's this experience of trying to create some beauty, some flow, some rhythm, some patterns in the digital workplace that aren't just about single sign-on, authentication, etc. And interestingly enough, we're doing quite a lot of work with Estee Lauder to help them communicate with everybody across the organization, including all the people you see selling their perfume in all the different retail stores. And they were the ones who said to me, beauty's not skin deep. So if you're going to create beauty in your digital environment, it has to penetrate into the search functionality inside the organization and into the things deeper than just the surface layer. Verizon, interestingly enough, in thinking about their digital workplace, started to move beyond the concept of responsive design to say we're going to create a different digital ecosystem for mobile. So the things that people need to do on mobile devices are different to what they want to do on a desktop. So we're going to think about that. The bad news is it took them 6 years to get to this point. Why? Because of all the cultural issues, all the change management issues, all the lack of stakeholder alignment, etc., etc. And one of the things that I often hear, so don't feel like you're unusual, is this is really hard work. I'm talking about the easy things, which is trying to create a vision of what your digital workplace can be like. But we had a presentation yesterday from one of the UK retailers, and it was a picture of their new, what they called intranet-driven digital workplace, where the intranet is a front door into a better digital workplace environment. And they said it had been such hard work. But having done it inside the organization, other parts of that company were then coming to them and asking what their change management methodologies were. How did you manage to get all the different stakeholders together? And this really is important, and it's not just for knowledge workers. And I'm probably less interested in the knowledge workers inside the organization. I'm more interested in the guys who are collecting the refuse and the logistics and the manufacturing and the retailing, the front line, because that's where the digital transformation is really being felt most. I mean, Zara, the clothing store, took their shop assistants who were doing quite a mundane job and turned them into market researchers. so that they're learning what customers want, they're talking to customers, and they're feeding that data back into manufacturing in Northern Europe, in Northern Spain, and then 8 weeks later, they're seeing some of those products on the shelf. So you think about it from the point of view of working in one of those Zara stores. You turn from being one of those irritating people who comes up and says, "Can I help you?" I don't know if people do that here when you go into shops. But they turn into somebody who's building market intelligence. And I think, just getting back to my example of the person clearing the garbage, it's the same kind of things. I think it's quite fascinating when you start to take individuals who've not been exposed to this level of data and knowledge and insight, and you start to connect them to the technology. And I think some of the illustrations of this are happening amongst young children. There's somebody I don't know if you heard about called Jake Andraka. And at 15, one person in his family died of pancreatic cancer. And so with no medical knowledge, he starts researching pancreatic cancer. And I saw him interviewed on Newsnight, which is one of the main news programs in the UK, along with a head of pancreatic, a head of cancer at one of the major teaching hospitals in London. Jake Andraka had discovered a way of detecting pancreatic cancer that was 90% better than anything that had existed before. So you take one bright 15-year-old and you take a Google search box, and it's a magic elixir. So think about that inside your organization. Take individuals who've not had access to the information, the knowledge, the dashboards, the information, and you start to plug them into that, and you can uncover massive amounts of potential. One of the things that Barclays did that made their program very successful is that they took young people inside the organization and they asked for volunteers to help mentor other people in this new digital transformation. And they created 3,000 what they call digital eagles. And they became an evangelist movement inside the organization. Inside your own companies, that latent energy exists. It builds recruitment, it builds retention. They tell their friends about it. They say, you can join Barclays, it's not like a normal bank. That's the latent potential. If we're looking at beauty and design in this digital environment, and I referenced Adobe, who've obviously created products like that, I think the person who really understood this first was Steve Jobs. Why did we all fall in love with Apple products? It was because he started to realize that the invisible world, the digital world, could be created in a beautiful way. His background was in calligraphy, in handwriting. And he started to bring that beauty into the digital environment and turned Apple, even since he died, into the most successful company in the world. This is just another example of a digital workplace, to me, worth working in. It presents you with all of your HR information. What's really interesting is if while you're looking at your own personal information, somebody walks behind you, the part that's confidential starts to blur out. So they're starting to think about the experience. Yes, I'd love to be able to see all my HR information and my pay and where I'm up to with my pension, but what about the confidentiality? One interesting thing is the interplay between the physical and the digital. And one of the things that Timothy Leary, who was a Harvard business professor and sort of LSD guru, if you like, said there was that, I seem to be talking about people who've died a lot today. Yeah, before he died, he said, in the future, physical meetings will become sacred and they'll take on mythical importance. So gatherings like this will have a different quality to the one they had in the past. Because frankly, there's a lot of information here that you could be experiencing and getting virtually. I mean, when we did Digital Workplace 24, we probably crammed 4 different weeks of content into 24 hours. But there's something particular when people meet. But I don't think organizations have really started to exploit the real potential of the physical connections. I mean, this insurance company I was in yesterday, when you looked around the office, actually what you saw was people in their own separate environments. So they go into the office, commuting into the office, which I still don't understand why we do, and then they sit in isolation, occasionally talking to their colleagues. So mainly where they are is in digital environments. So the potential hasn't really been realized. There are issues in the digital workplace. It's not all smooth sailing. It's hard work. It takes a long time. There's also fragmentation. We get this experience of isolation. My own company has about 100 people in it. We are fully distributed. We don't have any offices. We used to have an office in London, one in New York. We closed them down. I actually was a bit nervous about that. Actually, it brought the company closer because I say you don't need to be physically present, but you need to be digitally present. So when I sit down here, I'll be able to connect into lots of different colleagues around the world just as I could anywhere. There isn't some office where things are happening that I don't know about. And everybody who wasn't in the physical offices said that they felt they created a level playing field. However, at times I miss my colleagues. At times it's quite isolating. I don't think working from home is the answer. I think it's an alternative. I think we're trying to create more places where we can meet that aren't just the kind of central offices that of the past. The other problem is if you make work that is actually more rewarding, and if you make work that you can connect to whenever you want, you start to build addiction. And we've probably all experienced this, checking emails in the middle of the night when you wake up, doing that on holiday just because you're a little bit bored. You know, those sort of things. So we're starting to build up the addiction. I think separation between work and life is very important. I'm not sure I agree with the kind of controlling aspect of the German Works Councils, which, by the way, comes up around the world as a kind of issue for global organizations as they struggle to try and negotiate them. I did see a very interesting, quite amusing thing. There was one of the German Works Councils who were actually using Yammer themselves and then were concerned about their own internal use of a tool that they didn't really approve of. But there is the other thing that we're seeing in this world, and it's partly in this investment in the physical workplaces, is what I call the revenge of the office. The office had no competition in the past. Now it does. The digital environments are probably richer and more interactive than the physical environments. So offices are sort of fighting back, saying we can get mingling spaces, we can do things that you can't do in digital environments. I'm not sure if that's actually going to succeed or whether it's just a last gasp. We will see. And by the way, one thing that's changed is that in the days of intranet, it was always the poor relation. Now what you're getting is people like Richard Branson, Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, saying the most important part of the organization are your people and your internal processes. If you want to be effective outside, you need to be effective inside. And this was the first time that CEOs put as their number one making the most of their staff. Prior to that, it had always been about customers. This is just an example of something that I picked up when I'd been to IKEA. In Sweden, they have this lovely concept of Fika. Fika is where you sit down, have coffee, and chit-chat to each other over cake. It's excellent. And I started writing a blog post, which was how do you create Fika in the digital workplace? And I think you can do it, but it takes work. It's about communication, authenticity. When people in my company have problems or somebody in their family's not well, they share that information, they share it within our collaborative community. And you start to kind of build some of these characteristics, but again, it takes work. And making sure that you do meet in person, and when you do, that it matters. So just to kind of end with a little story. One of the books I've been reading is called Sapiens, which I'd really recommend to anybody. It's written by an Israeli professor, and it's about the evolution of our species. And it really shows you that the things that we think are fixed in the future aren't, that a lot of these things are stories that we've made up. The concept of all the companies that we work for and that I created myself are constructs. So when you're thinking about the digital transformation of your organization and some of the obstacles, realize that you're in the kind of vanguard. You're trying to do things inside your organization, bringing different stakeholders together. And it might not be easy work, but it is work that is transforming the digital world of work. Thank you.